The day began with shouting. From the porch, Eleanor Whitmore watched her husband drive the ranch hands across the corral, his voice carrying over the wind like a lash. James Rourke believed order was louder than mercy, and the men had learned not to argue. She stood in the doorway, hands clenched behind her skirt, pretending the morning light was just bright enough to blind her from the cruelty she'd married. The workers moved with mechanical rhythm, eyes fixed on the dust, except one. Chaska, the tall Lakota man near the gate, didn't flinch when Rourke cursed him for being slow. He simply adjusted the harness on the wagon, calm as stone, the muscles in his jaw tightening only once. That quiet defiance unsettled Rourke more than open rebellion ever could. Eleanor had noticed it for months, the way Chaska did what was asked but never bowed his head, never gave away a piece of himself. To her husband, that made him dangerous. To her, it made him the only man on the property who still looked human. When the shouting finally ended, Rourke strode toward the house, sweat shining on his temples. "He'll learn respect," he muttered, brushing past her. Eleanor didn't answer. Her voice had learned silence the way others learned obedience. She watched him disappear into his office, the door closing like a verdict. Outside, Chaska was still working long after the others drifted toward water. His movements were patient, almost reverent, as he lifted a broken fence rail and reset it with deliberate care. For a moment, she thought he might look up. And then he did. Their eyes met across the yard. And time seemed to stretch thin between them, two prisoners of different kinds measuring the same distance to freedom. She looked away first, heat rising to her cheeks, though she couldn't name why. That evening, when Rourke drank by the fire and barked at her to play the piano, she did, fingers stiff, eyes unfocused. The melody felt like a cage with painted walls. Through the window she saw a lantern moving near the barn, Chaska working still, light circling his shadow like a halo of labor and patience. She struck the wrong note and froze. "Play," Rourke growled. She obeyed, but her heart wasn't in the keys. Somewhere out there in the dark, a man endured in silence, not out of weakness but strength. And for the first time, Eleanor envied someone who owned nothing at all. By sunrise, the ranch was already alive with the rhythm of work. The metallic clatter of bridles, the low groan of wagon wheels, the dull thud of boots across hard dirt. Eleanor moved through it like a ghost of habit, carrying breakfast to the men's quarters the way she always did, though no one dared thank her within Rourke's sight. Chaska stood apart from the others, repairing a harness strap with hands steady as prayer. When she set the bread and coffee on the table, he nodded once, neither servile nor proud, just human acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you." It startled her more than if he'd spoken her name. Later, when the heat rose and the men scattered to the fields, she found herself by the corral again, watching him work alone. The rope burns on his wrists looked old, healed over years but never forgotten. She'd heard Rourke call them the marks of debt, yet something in Chaska's silence made her doubt it. She asked, barely above a whisper, "Do you have family somewhere?" He looked up, sunlight catching the old scar across his temple. "They think I'm dead," he said simply, returning to his task. She wanted to ask more, but Rourke's voice thundered from the porch, ordering her inside. That night she lay awake, listening to the low hum of crickets and the faint sound of a song in a language she didn't know drifting from the barn. It wasn't defiant, just haunting. The melody lingered in the walls long after it stopped. Days later, when a storm snapped the water trough rail, Chaska worked through the rain, refusing to leave it broken. Eleanor ran out with a towel, ignoring Rourke's warning glare. "You'll drown yourself," she said, trying to make light of it. He shook his head, rain carving lines through the dirt on his face. "I've seen worse weather." She almost smiled, realizing he wasn't talking about storms. The next morning she overheard her husband bragging to a visiting sheriff that Chaska was indentured by law, a debt-bound worker for life. The words made her stomach turn. She had never seen a contract, never seen the law her husband quoted so easily. When the sheriff rode off, she asked, "How long does the contract last?" Rourke's answer was as sharp as the whiskey on his breath. "As long as I say it does." That night, she found herself outside again, drawn to the faint glow of the barn where Chaska slept among the horses. The distance between them wasn't just space. It was everything she'd been taught to fear, and for the first time, she wanted to cross it. The letter arrived by accident. Eleanor had been asked to deliver her husband's ledger to the general store in town, a routine errand that let her breathe air not owned by James Rourke. The ride was long and quiet, the Montana sky too wide to carry secrets. At the store, while the clerk searched for receipts, a slip of paper fell from between the ledger's pages, a folded government document stamped with an old territorial seal. Her eyes caught the name before her mind understood it. Chaska Red Elk. The printed lines below declared him a free man under federal decree, dated 3 years prior. The world tilted. She read the page twice, then again, her hands trembling as the truth rearranged everything she thought she knew. Her husband's story, of a man paying off a debt, of labor owed, was a lie. Chaska wasn't bound by law. He was held by cruelty. She slipped the document into her skirt pocket, the weight of it heavier than any weapon. On the ride back, dust rose behind her horse like smoke from a burning world. Every board of the ranch looked different now, every fence a prison wall. At supper, she could hardly lift her fork. Rourke droned on about cattle prices and rail contracts, his words turning hollow. "You look pale," he said at last. "Too much sun." She forced a smile. Perhaps. But when his gaze drifted away, she studied his face with new eyes. The mouth that smiled for no reason, the eyes that never saw anyone as whole. That night, when the house went still, she unfolded the paper again under lamplight. The ink had faded, but truth doesn't spoil with time. She imagined Chaska in chains when the law had already broken them. She thought of the rope scars on his wrists, the song he'd sung to no one. Rage crept in quietly, uninvited but righteous. She wanted to confront Rourke immediately, to slam the document on his desk, but power like his didn't fall to words shouted in private. It had to fall in daylight, where the world could see. So she hid the paper inside her Bible, the only place her husband never looked, and closed it with shaking hands. In the dark, she whispered to herself, "You're not the only one living a lie, James." And though her voice was small, it felt like the first crack in the empire he'd built on silence. Eleanor woke before dawn, the paper's secret pressing against her chest like a hidden heartbeat. The ranch stretched silent under a gray sky, and every sound, the creak of the windmill, the whinny of a horse, seemed to ask what she would do now that she knew. When she saw Chaska at the trough, his breath clouding in the cool air, she almost told him. But words failed under the weight of what they would mean. Instead, she carried on with her duties, though each movement felt rehearsed in someone else's play. Rourke barked orders from the porch, boots striking the boards with that same rhythm of ownership that had ruled her life for 7 years. She watched him touch the whip on his belt, an idle gesture, yet enough to remind her what defiance cost. At breakfast, he noticed her distraction. "You've gone soft, Ellie," he said. "You used to care how this place ran." She stirred her coffee, steady. I still do. Maybe I just care who pays for it. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. You'd do well to remember who keeps you fed. She met his gaze for the first time in months. I do, she said quietly. Every day. When he rode out later to check fence lines, she went to his office. The smell of tobacco and ink clung to the air. She opened drawers until she found what she hoped wasn't there. A second contract bearing Chaska's name, forged with shaky letters meant to look official. The signature at the bottom, Judge Avery's, was wrong. Her pulse quickened. She copied the false paper word for word onto a separate sheet and hid it beneath her shawl before setting everything back in place. When she stepped outside, Chaska was by the stable, watching the horizon. "The law is far away," he said without turning. She froze. "What makes you say that?" "You looked like someone who just saw how far justice has to travel." She wanted to tell him everything then, to promise that freedom was closer than he thought. But she bit the words down. If Rourke suspected her, Chaska would pay the price. That night, the wind howled through the empty corrals, rattling shutters like restless ghosts. Eleanor sat awake, her hand on the folded copy beneath her pillow. For the first time, she understood that silence wasn't safety. It was complicity. And when the dawn finally broke, she wasn't sure whether it brought light or simply made the chains easier to see. That evening, the ranch felt like it was holding its breath. The sun bled over the horizon, staining the sky the same color as old rust. And Eleanor knew something inside her had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Rourke had been drinking since late afternoon, pacing the porch with his rifle propped against the wall, barking orders that no one dared challenge. When a young hand stumbled while hitching a wagon, Rourke struck him with the back of his fist, sending the boy sprawling into the dust. Eleanor's heart lurched. The other workers stood frozen, too afraid to move, but Chaska stepped forward and helped the boy up, his face calm but his eyes burning. Rourke's fury flared, a man enraged not by disobedience but by decency. "Get back to your work, Red Elk," he shouted. Chaska met his glare in silence, and that silence was an act of war. Rourke turned on his heel and stormed into the house, the door slamming like a shot. The yard emptied quickly after that, leaving only the echo of boots and wind. Eleanor stayed by the window, pulse hammering, until she saw Chaska's shadow move past the lantern light of the barn. She hesitated, then followed. He was sitting on a bale of hay, shoulders hunched, the quiet around him heavy but not defeated. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking at her. "Neither should you," she replied, her voice trembling despite herself. He finally turned, eyes reflecting the lamp's dim glow. "You found something, didn't you?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, and I wish I hadn't. It changes everything." Chaska nodded slowly, as if he already knew what her words meant. "Truth always does." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof like a warning. "He'll kill you if he finds out," Chaska said quietly. "Maybe," she answered, "but I'd rather die knowing I wasn't his anymore." He looked at her with something that wasn't pity. It was recognition, the same quiet courage she'd seen in him that first day. "Freedom doesn't wait for permission," he murmured. She wanted to tell him that she was ready to risk everything, but the sound of boots on gravel cut her breath short. Rourke's voice bellowed from the dark yard, her name slicing through the storm. Chaska rose slowly, shoulders squared. "Go," he whispered. She hesitated only a moment before running for the house, her heart pounding with a truth that had finally learned how to breathe. By morning, the storm that had rattled the roof all night had passed, but the air still carried its tension. The sky hung low, a flat gray lid pressing over the valley, and Eleanor knew the peace wouldn't last. Rourke was quieter than usual, which was always more dangerous than his rage. He watched her pour his coffee, his eyes sharp, like a man sniffing for betrayal. "You were out last night," he said finally. She steadied her hands. "Checking the kitchen door. It kept blowing open." He didn't answer, but his silence was its own kind of verdict. When he left for the barn, she exhaled shakily, then went to her room and retrieved the hidden copy of the forged papers. The ink had bled slightly from her trembling hands, but the words were still there, undeniable. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and tucked it beneath her shawl. That evening, Rourke gathered every worker in the yard, claiming he wanted to inspect the livestock for theft. It was theater. Eleanor knew it, and so did they. The men lined up beside the corrals, their faces a mixture of fatigue and fear. Chaska stood at the end, posture calm, the only one who didn't bow his head. The sun dipped low, and its light turned the dust into fire. Rourke strutted before them like a judge, pointing, lecturing, feeding his own ego. "Order keeps this place alive," he barked. "Any man who thinks he's above it will learn the price of arrogance." His gaze flicked toward Chaska, the target already chosen. Eleanor stepped down from the porch, heart racing, fingers tightening around the hidden papers. Every voice in her head screamed to stop, to wait, to survive another day, but she'd already learned that silence had a cost too high to pay. Chaska met her eyes briefly, a warning there, a plea to stay safe, but she shook her head almost imperceptibly. When Rourke ordered everyone to assemble again at dawn for discipline and inspection, she knew what it meant: a public punishment, a show of power. As the workers dispersed, she lingered by the well, the paper heavy against her ribs. Chaska approached quietly, his voice low. "Don't fight him in the dark," he said. "He wins there." She nodded. "Then we'll bring him into the light." His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something passed between them. Trust, maybe even fate. When the wind rose again, carrying the scent of another storm, she realized it wasn't the weather she feared anymore. It was what she'd become, someone finally brave enough to stand in the open and dare the world to strike. The next morning broke bright and cruel, the kind of daylight that left no shadows to hide in. Eleanor stepped from the house before her husband called her name, the folded papers hidden beneath her sleeve, her breath steady even as her hands trembled. The ranch yard was already full, the workers lined along the fence, the air thick with dread. Rourke stood in the center, whip coiled at his side, every inch of him performing power. "This ranch runs on respect," he barked, pacing before them. "And when a man forgets his place, he's reminded." His gaze locked on Chaska, who stood motionless near the trough. Eleanor's pulse hammered, her body moving before her mind could stop it. "That's enough," she said. The sound of her voice startled even herself. Rourke turned slowly, disbelief cutting across his face. "You forget your place." "Wife?" She stepped forward, refusing to lower her eyes. "He stole nothing. You did." The words landed like gunfire. The crowd murmured. Chaska's jaw tightened. Rourke laughed, a sound with no warmth. "What nonsense have you dreamed up now?" She reached into her sleeve and held out the papers, the wind snapping their edges. "He's a free man by law. These prove it. You forged the rest." Silence struck the yard. Rourke snatched the papers, eyes scanning the ink, his smirk faltering when he saw the official seal. For a moment he looked small, cornered, exposed. Then the fury came, wild and red. He backhanded her so hard the world blurred white. The workers gasped but didn't move. Eleanor staggered, blood on her lip, but her voice didn't break. Everyone here has lived under your lie, she said. Not anymore. Rourke lunged for her again. But before he could, Chaska stepped between them. No weapon, no shout, just his body, a living wall of defiance. Touch her, he said softly, and the whole world will finally see what you are. For a heartbeat, even the wind stopped. Rourke froze, his hand still raised, and the men who'd once feared him shifted uncertainly. Power was leaving him. Eleanor could feel it, draining like water through cracked earth. Go ahead, she whispered. Show them. But he didn't. He turned away, eyes full of hate and panic, realizing too late that something larger than ownership had just been broken. Chaska stayed where he was, steady as the horizon, while Eleanor straightened beside him, her fear gone, her silence finally buried in the dust at their feet. For a long moment after her defiance, the yard stayed frozen. No one dared breathe, as if even the air waited to see what James Rourke would do next. His pride couldn't survive humiliation, not in front of the men who once jumped at his orders. His hand twitched toward the whip at his belt, the leather unraveling like a snake waking to strike. You forget who you are, he growled, voice shaking with something far uglier than rage. Eleanor stood tall, despite the blood drying on her lip. No, she said clearly, her tone calm but carrying. For the first time, I remember. Chaska stayed between them, unflinching, though Rourke's shadow swallowed his. Move aside, Rourke barked, raising the whip. She's mine. The word broke something in her once and for all. I belong to no one, she said, loud enough for the men to hear. For the ranch itself to echo. Rourke's arm came up, ready to strike, not her this time, but Chaska. The crack of leather split the air before the pain could. Chaska didn't flinch. He caught the lash mid-air, the sound more thunder than flesh. The whip dangled from his hand like a dead thing. The workers gasped. Rourke lunged, but before he could reach them, the sheriff's voice boomed from the gate. James Rourke, drop it! Everyone turned. Sheriff Dowling rode in hard with 2 deputies, a dust cloud trailing him. We got a message from Helena, he said, holding up papers, about a certain Lakota man whose freedom was stolen. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady but shaking from relief. You'll find his name there, and my husband's lies beneath it. Rourke backed away, face ashen. You can't prove— We can, the sheriff cut in. Forgery, fraud, and unlawful bondage. The words rolled out like judgment itself. Chaska dropped the whip to the ground and said nothing. Rourke tried to run, but the deputies caught him before he reached his horse. Eleanor didn't move. She just watched the empire of her fear collapse plank by plank. When the men led Rourke away, she turned to Chaska. His expression wasn't triumph. It was peace, worn and raw. You risked everything, he said quietly. So did you, she answered. We just did it at different times. The workers slowly took off their hats, not from command but respect. For the first time, the ranch yard was silent, not from fear, but from freedom being born in front of them. The courthouse in Helena smelled of dust and iron, the kind of place where truth felt heavy enough to bend the air. Eleanor sat at the front bench, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had turned white, while Chaska stood beside the sheriff, his shoulders squared but calm. Across the aisle, James Rourke looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. His arrogance stripped away, his wrists shackled instead of hers. The judge, a stern man with gray hair and tired eyes, read from the stack of documents in front of him. The papers presented confirmed that Mr. Chaska Red Elk was declared a free citizen of this territory in 1884. Any claim of ownership thereafter is void under the law. His words fell like the sound of a lock turning open. Eleanor dared to breathe again. Rourke's lawyer tried to twist the argument into talk of contracts and misunderstandings, but the forged signatures told their own story. When the judge's gavel came down, the verdict rang clear: fraud, unlawful captivity, and abuse of authority. Rourke's sentence: 10 years in Deer Lodge Penitentiary. The courtroom murmured, and someone in the back whispered, "About time." Rourke turned toward Eleanor then, eyes burning with disbelief. "You ruined everything," he hissed. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said softly. "You did." He was led away, shouting her name, but the noise faded under the creak of boots and paper. When the room emptied, Judge Avery stepped down and nodded toward her. "You did right, Mrs. Whitmore. Not many women in this territory would have risked their life for a man the law forgot." Eleanor looked at Chaska. "He reminded me what freedom actually means," she said. The judge's expression softened. "Then I reckon you've both earned it." Outside, the morning sun poured over the courthouse steps, blinding and pure. The townsfolk stared as Eleanor and Chaska walked out side by side, not scandal, but wonder. For once, she didn't lower her gaze. "Where will you go now?" she asked as they reached the hitching post. He looked out toward the distant ridges, where the prairie met the sky. "Home," he said. "Wherever truth can breathe." She smiled faintly. "Then let's build it." They rode out under the widening light, the clatter of hooves echoing through streets that had once looked like cages. Behind them, the courthouse doors shut. And ahead of them, the land stretched open, wide, wild, waiting. Months later, when the snows melted and the grass came alive again, the ranch no longer bore the name Rourke. The old sign had been burned on a quiet evening and replaced by a new one carved by the hands that once worked in chains, the House of the Free. Eleanor Whitmore, no longer a wife bound by fear, stood on the same porch where she'd once watched men be broken, her face turned toward the sunrise instead of the ground. The yard was alive with honest work, horses saddled without shouting, laughter echoing from the corrals, the rhythm of labor that didn't bleed. Chaska walked beside the newly repaired fence, sleeves rolled, a calm steadiness in his movements that made the air feel lighter. When their eyes met, words weren't needed. They had spoken their truth in acts that had cost them everything and given them more in return. He came to the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. "We'll have to rebuild the east line before winter," he said. She smiled. "We," she repeated softly, tasting the word like something holy. He nodded, then looked toward the distant hills. "When I was taken, they told me freedom was a word white men wrote on paper. But it feels different when you can smell the wind and know it's your own." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "I used to think freedom meant belonging to no one. Now I think it means belonging nowhere you can't choose to stay." Chaska's smile was faint but real. Behind them, the workers had started to gather for supper. Martha ringing the bell, Ben laughing with his father, the kind of ordinary peace that once seemed impossible. As dusk fell, they walked toward the stable together, the lantern in Eleanor's hand casting a warm glow over the dirt path. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked after a while. "Not the choice," he said, glancing toward her. "Only the years before it." She nodded, understanding without needing to speak. The stars rose one by one above the wide Montana plain, bright as the first night after a storm. In the stillness, the world no longer belonged to cruelty or law. It belonged to those who had survived it. Eleanor blew out the lantern when they reached the door, the dark now gentle, no longer something to fear. Inside, the air smelled of hay and rain. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start again." Chaska smiled, the light of the hearth flickering against his face. "We already have. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her stand between them, would you have spoken or stayed silent? Tell us in the comments.